Hello and welcome for the first time to the Suits and Laterals podcast. I am Jeff Rich, and along with my voice, you'll be hearing the voices of Damian Bowman and Chris Green. We're here to talk about the NFL, and we're going to take on the NFL from a couple different angles here. First, we look at the league from a more white-collar perspective, but we're not going to abandon what happens between the sidelines, and for that matter, what happens between the snap and the whistle. But before we get into our topics for episode 1 here, let's introduce the rest of the cast. Damian, welcome. Why don't you tell us what you hope we're going to deliver with this podcast?
How are you, Jeff?
I'm doing well.
Good. It's good to talk to you. It's been a couple weeks. I'm here to talk about football, like you said, and I'm here to have fun with you too. And the three of us don't get to podcast together that often, so I'm hoping to have fun first of all, and then to get into the issues of money and suspensions and discipline and Pete Carroll not running the ball in the Super Bowl, and how good or bad of a coach Mike Pettin is.
What would you say your interest is in the NFL? What's your relationship with the NFL as a consumer, Damian?
I am about as casual an NFL playing fan as you can, because most of my focus is on college football through Campus Press Box. But I am acutely, I don't even know if that's the right word, tuned into the business and officiating side of it because of just my general interest in that stuff.
All right, you heard it, guys. He's got his ear on the ground. He's not a rah-rah fan, but he certainly knows what he's doing here. Speaking of knowing what they're doing here, Chris, let me flip it for you a little bit here. What is something that you're anticipating seeing on the field in 2015?
The Cleveland Browns sucking?
That's a little bit of a given. Anything from a more macro perspective on the league?
It should be an interesting year. I mean, you've got this whole new extra point set up that's going to happen this year, so I'm curious to see how that works out and see how many more teams decide to go for 2 this year. So I think that could change a lot of the strategy in the games. It's the old let's just kick an extra point isn't what it used to be. So teams are going to have to think about that more. We've got a couple of interesting rookie quarterbacks coming out this year, and Marcus Mariota and Jameis Winston. And they are going to play right away, it sounds like. So that could be interesting. We'll see what happens with this whole New England situation. If Tom Brady's going to play or not at the beginning of the season, that could affect their playoff hopes somewhat. And I mean, you got a lot of players that move places this year. So there's just a lot of things going on in the league, and it'll be interesting to see, is it going to be the same 2 teams that were in the Super Bowl last year with Seattle and New England, or are we going to see some of these new and young blood coming up?
Hey, when you talk about parity, you talk about a league that might not be top heavy. What do you think of the competitive balance in the league? Now, granted, we haven't seen a preseason game. We don't know anything about 2015 yet. But what's your feeling on competitive balance in the National Football League in general, Chris?
I think it's very, very even right now. I think I don't know that there's any real favorites. I mean, you're going to get the Homer fans who are going to say, yeah, the Seahawks will be back. Yeah, the Patriots will be back, or the Colts are going to be right there. But it just goes to show, last year, I mean, did we really expect Arizona, if they hadn't had all the injuries, I mean, they may have gone really far into the playoffs, but there's always some surprise team out there you just don't expect, whether that's the Bills this year with Rex Ryan taking over, or maybe you see something out of Miami now that their defense has been ramped up even more with Ndamukong Suh. So there's just always some surprise every year.
Okay, one team that won't surprise us, and this is our first topic of the day, the first topic of Suits and Laterals, is Russell Wilson and the Seattle Seahawks. We will not be surprised to see them there, but they did a number in the offseason to make sure that they can maintain the success, at least at the quarterback position, in bringing back Russell Wilson. Damian, let's hear from you first. Russell Wilson and his impact as a third-round pick, getting paid about $600,000 a year in his best year financially. That's not counting the off-the-field endorsements. How important was it for Seattle to get this deal done, to take Russell Wilson from a guy that's making about $700,000 a year to a guy that's going to average about $22 million a year over the next 4 years? Is Seattle overplaying the hand here, or was this a necessary step, and was it necessary to get it done right now?
Well, I think it's obvious that Russell Wilson intended to hold out if he didn't get paid, and I think if you're the Seattle Seahawks, you need him there, day one of camp. And I'm not sure exactly, what their other options are, to be honest with you. But I think the thought, at least for him, of being traded to maybe Cleveland or Philadelphia or whatever was enough for him to get his agent to agree to something, at the deadline.
Chris, was it worth it? Would it have been worth it for Paul Allen and John Schneider to maybe play hardball a little bit with Wilson to try to keep his value down? Because that seems to be almost as much of an attribute to the whole Russell Wilson situation as his play on the field itself, is just how much value they've gotten out of him being a third round pick, being in going into his fourth year in the NFL.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's nice to have that value there, but I think it's even more important to have a quarterback who's not worrying about his financial situation, whose entire focus is on the field and not worrying about if he's one injury away from being out and losing $100 million or whatever, and that's all gone for now. So I think they made the right move in getting him signed. I think it was a reasonable contract for both sides, in all honesty.
Damien, do you feel this deters Russell Wilson's flirtation with Major League Baseball? I know that he said that it would have to be with the Mariners. Texas Rangers currently hold his rights. Do you see him taking this money as a sign to kind of kiss the baseball dream goodbye?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he has a choice at this point. I mean, I think it would be incredibly irresponsible of him, not only to his playing career, but more importantly to his teammates, to even consider the prospect of playing baseball. I think the days of guys like Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders playing multiple sports is gone. And while I don't like it, I think that it's best for everybody involved.
Chris, the outside interest, including the multitude of commercials that he's done, whether it's to supplement his income or whether he's just pouncing on the opportunity, do you think we see him cut back the endorsement deals a little bit now that the checks are coming in from Seattle and it's a respectable amount for a Super Bowl winning quarterback?
I doubt it. I mean, do we really see any of the other pro athletes out there tone down the commercials once they sign big deals? I mean, if anything, I would think this may even increase his value or popularity even a little bit more. I mean, fans aren't going to be wondering whether he's going to go to another team now. He's pretty much locked into Seattle for at least the next 4 years, most likely. All
right. Damien, Aaron Rodgers is the highest paid player in the league. Right after that, you have Russell Wilson. Is that an appropriate slotting? And does being the highest paid versus second and third highest paid really matter in the grand scheme of things?
Well, I think the difference between the two is that Aaron Rodgers' deal was signed in 2013, and the salary cap is, 30% higher now than it was back then. So Russell Wilson's a pretty good quarterback, and he's earned his money. And if I'm Aaron Rodgers, I'm happy for Russell Wilson, and I'm not, at the doorstep of whomever my GM is asking for more money. I think I'm doing okay. I think it's the guys that are after Wilson that are going to be the ones that show up. The Ben Roethlisbergers who might say, hey, I've got 1 or 2 or 10 or however many Super Bowls. How does this kid have more money than me? What's going on here? And I think that that's the disconnect. But that's why, Schneider and those guys signed Russell Wilson this year, because they knew that next year the cap number would be significantly higher. So I think for them, they had to get, like Chris said, get the value out of him now, but also not go crazy, if they wait until next year.
Well, and who's happy about this is Andrew Luck.
Sure.
Because that's only going to inflate his value when his contract's up.
Yeah, but how many Super Bowls does Andrew Luck have? I'm always confused about this.
He doesn't have any yet.
So why does this inflate his value? This is the part that I don't understand.
Well, I mean, Russell Wilson didn't win the Super Bowl on his own.
I understand that, but he still has a Super Bowl ring, right?
Yeah.
And does Andrew Luck have one?
He does.
Okay. So I guess, and I'm not, upset with you. I just don't understand why Andrew Luck thinks that he should get the same amount of money as Russell Wilson.
Because he's an elite quarterback who's considered one of the best in the game, and that's how they play it. They don't go by... I mean, Super Bowls are important in that, but you know how agents work.
So let me ask you this: if you could pick one team or one quarterback, and those were 2 choices, who are you taking?
Andrew Luck.
Because
I think he has a bigger impact on his team and on the game than Russell Wilson does. I think Russell Wilson has to have a good defense in order to get to win the Super Bowl, whereas Andrew Luck's defense has been horrible, and he had them on the threshold of the Super Bowl last year.
Chris, let me ask you this. You talk about Super Bowls, and obviously Seattle won 2 years ago. We're on the brink a year ago. Probably should have won it. They need their entire team, though. They need Marshawn Lynch, who came back. They need this defense, and they added Bobby Wagner and made him happy. But you're going to have problems with Michael Bennett and Cam Chancellor. At what cost? At what player cost is Russell Wilson worth the money, and when does it stop? Who do they lose that it stops?
It's already started. I mean, Tony McDaniel was released. So who was their starting defensive tackle the last couple of years? Because of salary concerns now with them signing Wilson to this deal and then with them signing Bobby Wagner. So, I mean, they're putting in Ataba Rubin, who they signed from the Browns after several years into his spot. So, I mean, that's going to affect their defense right away. I mean, anybody who watched the Browns knows Ataba Rubin isn't the greatest run defense player. So that's going to impact their defense. And you already hear the whispers coming from other players. Like you said, you mentioned Cam Chancellor aren't happy about their contract. So there's some dominoes are going to yet to fall.
They added a tight end in the offseason, a pretty significant one there, Chris. How much does that aid Seattle's offense with Russell Wilson signed long-term now?
Oh, that's a huge addition. I mean, he is a tight end, but he's better than almost all the wide receivers in the league as well. So that's he has the safety net now that he didn't necessarily have before, and he has a huge playmaker to go along with Marshawn Lynch.
Damian, Russell Wilson promises to take up about 12% of the cap. Do you think that that's something that's sustainable? Do you think that that's a reasonable deal that's sustainable when you consider how many assets that they really need in order to win the Super Bowl?
I think that 12% is cap friendly. If they need to sign anybody else, I mean, there's plenty of room, and the way that they spread his bonus out and everything else, like his yearly cap number, I don't think is ridiculous at all. I think that there's more than enough room for them to go out and to be able to sign anybody else that they need to. And I think that anybody who says that, that 12 or 15% or whatever number that his value or his drive to compete is going to decrease, I think they're way off base. I think this is very cap friendly.
Something else to think about is Seattle's been known for bringing in street free agents throughout the season and just plugging and playing. I mean, they were very successful with that the last couple of years. So if they have to get rid of a few of these larger contracts and go that route, they've already been there and done that, and it's worked for them. So that's something else to think about too.
So on September 13th, the Seahawks opened their season in St. Louis. They opened with back-to-back road games at St. Louis, at Green Bay. Green Bay is going to ramp up their defense a little bit. If the Seahawks come out of that, regardless of how the Seahawks come out of that, how much would you allow yourself to read into the results of those first two games, given that they're facing a formidable defense in the St. Louis Rams and a team that felt that they should have been the ones playing New England in the Super Bowl with the Green Bay Packers on Sunday Night Football, September 20th?
I think that'll be a good test for them. Especially since it's the 9 or the 8:30 game or whatever on NBC, and like you said, I mean, they're playing two good defenses in a row, and Green Bay is going to be up for them. But I think that this is still going to be a little bit early for Green Bay, and I think that Seattle might sneak by them depending on if everybody comes out of camp healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, you got to look at something too. Is last year Seattle struggled for, I don't know, about the first 8 weeks or so, at least, of the season, and a lot of people were wondering if they were even going to make it to the Super Bowl again, and then they really ramped it up to finish the season. So, regardless of the results early on, I wouldn't look too much into it anyway. Obviously, if they win both games, that's a positive for them. But if they were to lose both, and I don't think they're going to lose to St. Louis no matter what. I mean, St. Louis has a great defense, but they still are lacking at the quarterback position. And I mean, Green Bay will definitely be a huge test, but either way, I wouldn't look too much into it.
Yeah, I'm looking up and down their schedule, Chris, and I see a lot of playoff teams. Green Bay, Carolina, San Francisco, or actually not San Francisco, but Dallas, Arizona, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Baltimore Ravens. That Ravens game is in Baltimore. How do they face these challenges, or do you think that they just take that Pete Carroll just takes the field week to week and doesn't feel intimidated by the opposing team?
I think you just hit the nail on the head right there. I don't think they feel imposed on against anybody. So, I mean, they went in against the vaunted New England Patriots last year, and if not for a stupid decision at the end, they would have won the Super Bowl. So, I think they have a good chance against any of those teams. I mean, some of those teams you mentioned, Baltimore, I think they're going to take a step back this year. Pittsburgh, I think they'll score a lot of points, but I'm interested to see what that defense does. So they'll be good tests, but I like their odds in most of those games.
All right, Damian, did everybody else miss? Did 74 picks miss on Russell Wilson? Should he have gone in the first round, or did he really need to come into the league and prove himself, given what he did at NC State and at Wisconsin?
I think that 74 is probably the appropriate place for him, considering where he was and how he played in college. And I kind of say the same thing about Tom Brady. We can all say, oh, by the way, we should have drafted this guy in the first round. But in reality, who knew? I don't know who else was in that class. I can't remember. But where are those guys that were in his class? Are those guys still playing? Are they all playing at a high level? And sometimes your best players don't come in the first round. They come in the second and the third and the fourth round. And that's where Wilson came from. And I don't think that there should be any regrets by any of the other teams.
Well, Chris, Tom Brady being drafted 199th overall or 200th overall, wherever he was, it didn't inspire teams to look for franchise quarterbacks in the sixth round, in those late 100, early 200 picks. Does Russell Wilson inspire a GM to look for his franchise player? Now, granted, they weren't looking for a franchise. They were counting on Matt Flynn the year they drafted Russell Wilson. Can teams take a chance and say, we'll get our quarterback in the third round? We've got more important gaps to fill in the first two.
If you look historically, the answer is no. I mean, for every Tom Brady or Russell Wilson, there's hundreds of other quarterbacks that have failed in those rounds. I mean, if you look at the statistics, I believe 24 of the 32 quarterbacks are from the first round of the starting quarterbacks. So, I mean, most teams are going to get their quarterback in the first round, and anything past that, it's just really throwing darts at the wall.
All right. Nobody in the league, other than aside, from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, can claim that they missed out on Jameis Winston. And the only way that Tampa Bay misses is if he himself is a miss. First of all, Damian, you're the college guy. Was Jameis Winston the top talent in this NFL draft this past April?
Well, that's an interesting question, obviously, but I think for Tampa Bay he was. I think maybe in the long run he'll be a better NFL quarterback than Marcus Mariota was, or will be, excuse me. But I think, and as far as the NFL goes, I think Winston's a better quarterback, and that's something that we'll see in a year or so. But I think right now, I think Tampa Bay made the right choice by going with Jameis Winston.
Chris, was this the Tampa Bay's biggest area of need? They obviously earned the number one pick in the NFL draft. They were a bad team. Did it go farther than just the quarterback?
I mean, you can say they had holes on the defense, but I mean, they had some great receivers last year, and really the quarterback play held them back, in my opinion. So, I mean, Lovie Smith is a defensive coach, so he's going to keep working on that defense and keep plugging away. But if Winston plays well, I mean, they have a chance to make some big improvements this year, especially from where they came from. But I definitely think he's going to help them.
Florida State was a team on the brink, very loaded, kind of what Russell Wilson has, to be honest with you. Loaded defense, lots of weapons, O'Leary, Green, Kelvin Benjamin, a stout running game that first year. Last year was a different story for the Seminoles, and we kind of saw it implode in the Rose Bowl. But I think that it's going to be something that he's never experienced before, walking into a situation where he's not going to be successful right away. And I wonder, and he's also coming off his first loss since high school. I know that he'll be able to separate that, but it's going to be interesting to see how Jameis Winston handles walking into a previously losing culture.
What's the definition of success for Jameis Winston this year? Like, what's the barometer here?
I'd say 6 wins. I mean, if they tripled their win total from a year ago, basically just changing from Josh McCown, who was successful in a backup role in Chicago, to being a disaster in a starting role. I think that Jameis Winston has to win 6 games, and I think with Tampa Bay's schedule, it's possible.
For Winston to be successful, though, is it only based on wins, or is it improving from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, things like completions and fewer interceptions, or is it only wins and losses the barometer here?
Well, Malcolm Glazer said it himself. The owner of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers said it himself. He's like, "This is a growing year. We're trying to we're bringing in an exciting player. This isn't Cleveland trying to sell the Browns' chance on Manziel. This is our future." I don't know if he said anything along the lines of pace yourself or lower your expectations, but Tampa Bay's got an interesting situation in a not very strong NFC South there, where I think that they could steal 4 or 5 division games and end up being a 6-10 or 7-9 team. I don't think that they're threatening to win the NFC South by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that those things are generic. Improvement, progress. You want to see all that. Because in one world, 10 wins is an accomplishment. In another world, it gets your coach fired. So I think it's all relative. But I think the biggest thing I want to see from Jameis Winston is to go without incident, to be a professional. He hadn't been able to do that in 2 years at Florida State.
Well, and I think that's a big thing. I mean, you got to look at is his decision making, both on and off the field. You mentioned the interceptions, is that if he makes good decisions, he's going to not throw as many interceptions. But last year he threw 18 interceptions, and that's fairly high for a college quarterback. But he also threw a lot of passes. So if he limits that, then I think he'll have a pretty decent season on the field. I mean, he's got Mike Evans down there and Vincent Jackson. So I mean, those are both excellent receivers to help him out. But the bigger question, and I think that was really the biggest question with him coming into the league, was, will he be able to stay on, make good decisions off the field? And so, like you said, to this point, he has not. I mean, I don't think we've heard anything since he's been with Tampa, but it's early.
Jeff, let me ask you this. Do you think that if you're Malcolm Glazer, do you hire a guy to just basically live with him and make sure he doesn't get in anything?
I'm sure you have chaperones of some sort. How close or distant they are depends on how you can set the situation up. I grew up in Cleveland where Joey Bell became Albert Bell, and he became sober as Albert Bell, and he just happened to have a twin brother that was, that the Indians were able to hire to basically chaperone Albert to make sure he stayed out of his own way. And that's something that Bell struggled with, in his life after sports. Jameis Winston, how much can you monitor him? How much is he willing to be monitored?
Well, it doesn't matter how much he's willing to. I mean, you're the one with the investment, right? Like, sometimes don't you have to make the decisions for these people who are as young as Winston is and who has been through as much stuff as he's been through?
Doesn't he deserve a little bit of latitude to have a personal life?
Don't you have to earn that?
Sure. But, I mean, is he going to do it under extreme supervision, or is he going to do it under limited supervision? And I think that Lovie Smith is probably one to say, you're an adult now, you got to do this on your own to a certain extent. If they need to add measure, he hasn't screwed up as a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. I think that the draft day Instagram picture of him holding the lobsters was in poor taste, but he hasn't done anything monumental. He hasn't been involved in what he did in Tallahassee, or what he got mixed up with in Tallahassee was certainly enough, if you ask me.
So, and then here's my last question for you, or actually maybe for Chris. Do you think him being drafted by a team in Florida is good or bad for him?
Bad. I think he's been protected down there at Florida State. I mean, we've heard some things come out, but I got to wonder what didn't come out. I mean, you've heard all these stories about, well, they tried to cover this up, they tried to cover that up, whether it's true or not. So the fact that he's still in that same vicinity makes me think he still thinks he has that security blanket there. So it could be good or bad.
Hey, Chris, what do you think of the weapons that he's got on offense? Safarian Jenkins at tight end, Jackson and Mike Evans at the wide receiver positions. I'm not sure exactly what kind of line or running game the Buccaneers promised to have in 2015, but the cast that he's walking into is this something that maybe it's like a Tim Couch situation in '99 with the Browns, where he just had no one to protect him and he was just doomed to fail? Is there any of that going on with the Bucs?
Well, if I remember right, they invested a lot of money in the offensive line here the last couple of years. I know it hasn't all worked out, so I think he will have some protection. But, I mean, the names you just mentioned as far as the receivers, that's some big help he'll have right there. So, I mean, I saw Mike Evans play a couple of games last year, and if you just get it in the vicinity of him, he catches the ball. So that's a big help for any quarterback out there. I mean, we can all debate what Johnny Manziel's done so far in the NFL, but he sure as hell made him look like a great player in college. So if he can do that for Winston, that's going to be huge for him.
All right, Damian, week 1, we get our number 1 pick versus our number 2. Ken Wisenhunt has announced that Marcus Mariota will be the starter for the Tennessee Titans in week 1, barring preseason injury, of course. But who is more NFL ready, or is training camp going to determine whether Winston playing in that pro style offense at Florida State or Mariota playing in that gimmicky, I can't define it any other way other than being the Oregon offense. Does that Oregon offense prove to be a disadvantage to Mariota in his rookie season?
Well, I think if we're looking at just the September 13th game in a nutshell, I think it works towards Mariota's favor. He's at home, and if they're going to tell that offense for him, and it's going to be very, very familiar for him, the first 3 games in the preseason and then whatever they do in the 4th, and then, the opener at home, I think for him, familiarity works. With Winston, he might have all the weapons in the world, but like Chris says, if he's still throwing interception and making bad decisions, then it doesn't matter if the defense or the offense is better, if he can't keep the defense off the field.
Well, Tennessee's got a little bit of a different situation. They've got Zach Mettenberger waiting in the wings, and if they didn't end up being so bad, he'd probably be their starting quarterback going into camp. On the other hand, Winston has Mike Glennon, who most have given up on in the NFL circles. Is there a point that you bench Jameis Winston to just go with another hand if he doesn't play well, or do you just let him ride it out if you're Lovie Smith?
I think you got to let him ride it out. I mean, I guess the question is, how long are we talking here? Are we talking 4 or 5 games? Or are we talking the whole season? Because if it's me and it's Lovie Smith, like you're tied to this guy, so he's your guy for the year.
Chris, did Jameis struggles? Do you let it ride, or do you go with Mike Glennon?
I think you have to. I mean, if you need to take him out for a series or something at the end of the game, that's one thing. But you got to go back to him the next week because, I mean, we've seen so many quarterbacks with the Browns just not handled right. At some point, you just got to let the guy take his lumps and learn from it, because otherwise you're never going to know what you actually have there if you're going to try and rotate quarterbacks every 4 games. It's just stupid. So they got to roll with him and live with the mistakes and hope he figures it out. And even if he doesn't figure it out by the end of this season, you got to give him next season too to figure it out.
All right, gentlemen, a great discussion. First, we talked about Russell Wilson and the impact of his contract extension. We talked about Jameis Winston and his impact being the number 1 overall pick and a day 1 starter. That was Suits and Laterals. For Damian Bowman and Chris Green, I'm Jeff Rich. Check us out next time on Suits and Laterals.